Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our program. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes as folks sign on, but so glad you joined us. Hang tight. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our program. Thanks for joining us. We're going to get started in about a minute. Appreciate you signing on, and hold tight. We're going to get started in about 60 seconds. Well, good morning and welcome to our program this morning. Exciting program to offer you. My name is Sean Healy, and I serve as the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy for the CivXNow Coalition, which is a project of iCivics, and we're delighted this morning to partner with the Center for Education Equity at a Teachers College at Columbia University on this important event. Just a little bit about CivXNow. CivXNow is a coalition that's been in place since 2018, and we really seek to amplify the need for stronger K-12 civic education at both the state and the national level. We do that through narrative change, we do that through policy advocacy, and then certainly disseminating effective research and evaluation on civic education. This program is designed very much in that spirit. And before introducing today's moderator, I've been asked to provide some context on the current state of K-12 civic education in the United States. So on the heels of the events of January 6, 2021, and amidst ongoing toxic political polarization, institutional dysfunction, it's clear that our constitutional democracy is very much in peril. One point, as you'll see on this next slide, is civic knowledge is alarmingly low, with a bare majority of Americans, 56% to be exact, able to identify the three branches of government, which is actually a historic high since Annenberg's been collecting this information. But nearly 1 in 5 can't name any branches of government. And that's very clear if you drill down that folks really don't understand things like the First Amendment in application. At the same time, confidence in our democratic institutions is cratered. Just to give you an example, confidence in the three branches of government we just discussed ranges from 5% for Congress to a high of 16% for the presidency. So this kind of toxic brew of civic ignorance and distrust fuel political polarization, and our political polarization by most measurements is at the highest levels in the modern era. So you put these trends together, they actually correlate with a generational marginalization of civic education in K-12 schools. Just to give you one data point on that, according to the Council of Chief State School Officers, 44% of school districts have reduced time spent on the social studies since the advent of No Child Left Behind in 2002. And so therefore, it's not shocking when you sideline the social studies that it correlates with poor student performance on measurements of things like civic knowledge. Looking specifically at the National Assessment of Educational Progress in Civics, across multiple iterations of this test, student proficiency ranges from 20% to 25%. And the results, as you'll see on this slide, reveal inequitable access to evidence-based civic learning practices that we'll discuss today, like direct instruction, current events discussions, and simulations of democratic processes. So the neglect of social studies and civics is directly linked to decades-long education policies at the state and the federal levels that mandate the testing of basic literacy in English language arts and math through funding incentives. Specifically, and as a direct consequence of education policy, civic education has been chronically underfunded, both federally and locally. Currently, by our estimate, the federal government invests a mere 5 cents per K-12 student in civics, compared to $54 per student for STEM subjects. The evidence makes clear that decades of decline in both the quality and quantity of civic education have contributed significantly to the discord, dysfunction, and widespread disengagement plaguing our nation today. I'll leave it to the scholars that follow to speak to the empirical research on best practices in civic learning. But from a policy perspective, the CivXNow Coalition released its revised state policy menu in September 2021. As you'll see on this next slide, our key provisions include universal equitable access to high quality civic learning experiences. That includes a course in middle school and high school, designated instructional time in civics and social studies for students in K-12, and media literacy opportunities across the curriculum. That civics be centered in state standards, that state assessment and accountability measures be inclusive of civics, including our recommendation that there be diploma seals that 8 states have actually taken on, that there be high quality and ongoing pre and in-service professional development opportunities for educators so that they can learn both civics content and pedagogies, that schools and communities be recognized for their commitments to civic learning, and that school disciplinary policies be reflective of the principles of our constitutional democracy. And then ultimately, if we're successful in adopting some of these policies, that we adequately resource implementation. So kind of the landscape of where we're at with respect to this, we just are in the process of completing a national policy scan of state policies. And according to our unofficial results, 38 states and the District of Columbia require a high school civics course, but only 7 for a full year. 8 others require civics instruction, but not in the context of a standalone course. And 7 states have no high school requirement at all. Turning to middle school, the situation is bleaker with only 5 states requiring a standalone course. And Massachusetts is the only state requiring a full year of instruction. 25 additional states in DC do require civics instruction, but 20 do not. Civics is not officially assessed in 23 states, nor in the District of Columbia, but is assessed in a variety of manners in the remaining 27, passage of the US naturalization test, the most frequent vehicle. Finally, 24 states and DC provide students with credit for completing service learning projects, and 5 additional states encourage service learning programs at the district level. But strengthening civic education is not solely the province of states. As it has with STEM, the federal government has an affirmative role to play in prioritizing and resourcing K-12 civic education. So grants to states for teacher training, curriculum development, and student programming, accounting for the unique context of states and school districts. Congress must also authorize an expansion and more frequent administration of the aforementioned National Assessment of Educational Progress in Civics and United States History. The latter, the more frequent administration, will allow for state-level disaggregation of results and measurement of student performance at key benchmarks at 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grades. The last couple of iterations, we've only touched 8th grade. Incidentally, these priorities are embedded in the bipartisan, bicameral Civic Secures Democracy Act, as you see on this slide, introduced in the 117th Congress, that will authorize $1 billion annually for these purposes. So that's my setup. I'm delighted now to turn the program over to my friend and colleague, Rashid DeRosso, who's the Civics Program Director at Democracy Prep Public Schools. Democracy Prep Public Schools were founded in 2005 and operate a network of 24 high-performing charter schools in New York, New Jersey, Baton Rouge, Las Vegas, and San Antonio, educating 7,100 citizen scholars, primarily students of color, about what change is possible within American democracy. Former classroom teacher himself, DeRosso now ensures that Democracy Prep's learning ties back to the idea of building schools and scholars that are active in their communities. Rashid?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the introduction. Once again, everyone, I'm Rashid DeRosso from Democracy Prep Public Schools. We are a network that believes deeply that young people are the architects and heralds of a kinder, more equitable, more inclusive world, and that civic education plays a critical role in sustaining and enriching our democratic society. I'm delighted to be moderating today's panel, Civic Education, essential for sustaining US democracy. Our aims during our time together will be to reinforce the importance of providing our young people a high-quality civic education and to provide you with both insights and practical, actionable steps to deepen your understanding of this subject and adopt new approaches to your practice. This is a topic of great personal and professional interest to me, and I feel deeply grateful to the CivXNow Coalition and the Center for Educational Equity at Teachers College, Columbia University, for the opportunity to speak with 4 of the premier scholars in this field. Their work has had a profound influence on the way I approach my work at Democracy Prep, and I'm honored to introduce each of them now. David Campbell is the Packey JD Professor of American Democracy at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Campbell's research focuses on civic and political engagement, and specifically on the correlations between the civic education and civic experiences students receive in high school and voting and civic engagement later in life. Kawashima-Ginsberg is the Newhouse Director of CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at Tufts University. She oversees CIRCLE's wide-ranging portfolio of research and impact projects on youth civic preparation and participation in collaboration with its diverse partners and audiences. Kay's background in community psychology and social emotional learning informs her work at CIRCLE as a leading voice for youth civic engagement. Jane Lowe is an assistant professor of teacher education at Michigan State University. Dr. Lowe's research focuses on civic education with a specific interest in youth political engagement, the development of social studies curriculum, and the inequalities that exist within traditional civic education. Meira Levinson is the Juliana W. and William Foss Thompson Professor of Education and Society at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dr. Levinson is a normative political philosopher who works at the intersection of civic education, youth empowerment, racial justice, and educational ethics. Welcome, and thank you all for being here today. The first portion of our session will give our expert panelists an opportunity to share some of their research on civic education in our society today. I'll start with you, David. Sean has helped frame some of the statistics about civic knowledge and civic education in the United States. As you see it, what does research show about why civic education is important? To what extent does a well-designed civic education have a positive, lasting impact on civic participation later in life?
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Rashid, and everyone involved in this for organizing an event and for all of our audience. It's an impressive number of people who have signed up today, and that's a positive sign, I think, of the interest in this subject. When you look at the research that's been done on civic education, there are a few things that we've learned, a few consistencies. One is we do know that what happens in the classroom matters, but not necessarily to encourage students to vote. So what happens in the classroom, if you just think of the, specifically a civic course, generally seems to increase civic knowledge, and it could also increase students' sense of efficacy. But what does seem to have an influence on whether or not they vote later on in life is less what happens in the classroom and more what happens across the entire school, because schools are communities, and communities can foster a sense of responsibility and engagement and just the norm that one should be engaged. In fact, perhaps the best example of this is the democracy prep schools that have been mentioned already, in what is arguably the most rigorous analysis ever of a civic education program is of the democracy prep schools. I won't go into all the details, but basically this study was able to do for a school what you typically would find when you're studying, say, a drug trial. They were able to randomize who got the treatment of being in the democracy prep schools. And what that has meant is this very powerful research design that has shown that students who were a part of democracy prep, and in particular graduate from democracy prep schools, their voter turnout rates are just phenomenally high compared to their peers. I mean, to an extent that we've just never seen when we do these studies of, what drives people to the polls. And so that has demonstrated the proof of concept. So we know that, yeah, the school community can really matter. The next step is to figure out, okay, what is it about a democracy prep school that can now be transplanted into other types of schools? So you can sort of think of what we know as, well, if we have this cocktail of drugs, we can treat the problem. But now we need to figure out, okay, what exactly in the cocktail is the thing that we could adapt and use elsewhere? Does it need to be the entire cocktail? Can it just be some of it? That's the next step. But I think this is very encouraging, and the very fact that we have such research is, again, a positive sign that civics is being taken seriously in a way that it hasn't been in the past.
Thank you for that. And I'm curious if you would be able to just speak a little bit more about school ethos, because it sounds as though that in some ways there can also be an adverse effect depending on the setup of the school, the way that they interact with their students, when we're thinking specifically about students from marginalized populations. So I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you for raising that, because I don't want to make it sound as though, everything is sweetness and light when we study what happens with young people in schools, because what you've described as the ethos is actually an excellent way to think of a school culture, right? The sort of values that are found within the school that are lived out day to day. And we have also seen in other research that schools that have especially harsh, or we might say arbitrary disciplinary policies, that can have a negative impact on students' civic engagement over their life. So again, if they're in a school where they feel a part of the community, that seems to have a positive influence over their life course. If they're in an environment where the overall ethos is not very productive when it comes to disciplinary practices, and in particular, if that student and him or herself has been subject to those policies, that seems to have a long-term negative effect. So ethos can cut both ways.
Thank you so much for that, David. Yeah, I found it really fascinating as I was reading some of your research, just thinking about the ways that civic education has an interesting effect in marginalized communities in particular, that isn't necessarily one where that researchers would have immediately identified. It almost seemed as though it were a secondary effect to what civic education had set out to do. And I was wondering if you could speak just a little bit about, additionally, about how civic education has an impact on those marginalized communities, particularly in the surprising way that one may not necessarily see. Sure. Mm-hmm.
So the fancy $5 term for what you're describing is known as the compensation effect.
Yes.
And what civic education, or really any form of education, can do for young people who may not have had other exposure to, in the case of civics, a community or a family where they're learning about civic life, or they're learning about the political system, and they're learning about government. For students who come from a background like that, civics is particularly effective. And there's one form of civic education that is especially effective, and that is where they're exposed to the actual discussion of real world politics in the classroom, which these days has become itself somewhat of a charged issue to discuss. But the research is clear. When students are exposed to real politics in the classroom and have an opportunity to engage in discussion in a respectful way, they know more about politics, and they're more efficacious about their involvement in politics.
Thank you so much for that. And I feel that we're going to be spending quite a bit of time throughout this conversation looking at some of the additional formats that are necessary in order for us to have the impact that we're seeking to ensure that young folks are developing into empowered and engaged members of our society. So thank you, David. And Kay, I'd love to transition to you next. Circle, the organization that you lead, has done numerous studies of voting trends among young people, about why many young people don't vote, and about what can be done to increase youth voting. What do these trends and these studies tell us?
Thanks, and thanks, Richard. Good to see you, and good to see everyone. Thank you so much for coming and having me, and welcoming to talk about youth voting. So let me just mildly and politely set the record straight. So the youth voting has been historically low. We hit the historical low in 2014 when we saw, according to census, 20% turnout among youth. And that was a real problematic sign. But in the last two cycles, we have seen really positive trends. For instance, in both 2018 and 2020, young people far outpaced the overall growth of voting, which we were seeing, and how much they were voting more than the previous cycle. In 2018, they really did kind of shatter the previous records we've seen among youth voting, similar rate in 2020 in terms of historical voting. Other signs, like there's kind of a race-based gap that's really shrinking within the youth electorate too, which is really great things to see. And also the youngest of the young, like 18 to 19-year-old, who's oftentimes the first-time voter, no matter which election we're talking about, have been catching up to the older youth in terms of voting. So I have been saying for a couple of years now that what we knew about predicting youth voting in terms of demographic and age group and so on has kind of broken. And young people really did that by leading their way and organizing themselves, encouraging friends to vote and register, and actually door knocking, especially through pandemic when it was safest, perhaps for young people who are healthy to go. That said, a lot of times young people talk about not seeing relevance in the kinds of things that the politicians talk about, and not seeing their voice and their opportunities to really have a partnership with the political leaders as one major reason to disinvest in politics. But also they say things like, maybe I don't know enough to vote. We see that in 9 to 10% of young people all the time when we survey them. And of course, as young people who tend to have inflexible schedule, both in work and especially in life, now that we have kind of this pandemic and also gig economy being a really common way to work for young people, they might find the actual schedule of registering and voting as something that is actually a barrier. So we find that whenever you make registration and voting easier, the turnout does go up accordingly too. So many reasons, but you can figure it out. That said, I think, what we can tell from that in terms of implication is that there's so many things we can do when we try to strengthen what we do both at home and at school and neighborhood to strengthen the electorate and make sure that every young person is ready to vote by the time they turn 18. So those are things like actually simply asking them. The research actually find that asking is one of the biggest predictor of voting. But also we found that in previous couple studies we've done, if young people say they learned explicitly about voting in an election in nonpartisan matter, they actually are about 40% more likely to vote than those who do not learn that. We find that pretty consistently, and also find that that is not a consistent thing that young people learn. So that's that. There are, important things to remember about what's raising these youth voting in the past few cycles. One we've seen is really about the relationship. Young people have been leveraging personal relationship, people that are important to them, that's friends, teachers, family members, cousins, and mentors who are encouraging them personally. And that's really the biggest source of election contact young people are getting, especially in early age. It's not just social media, it's in-person relational contact. That's really important. Social relevance. So we're seeing young people coming into politics at a much younger age, like maybe 14, maybe even 12, to think about political matters. And that's how they come in. So by the time they turn 18, they're actually ready to vote. And finally, I think really thinking about educating for democracy, this generation really wants to become engaged, but we still have to really support them by teaching them really explicitly why they should vote, how important it is for everybody to vote to sustain this democracy. So you can do that everywhere, but especially school holds a really important lever for that.
Thank you so much, Kay. As I was thinking about engaging with young people, it's undeniable that media now is playing an increasingly significant role in shaping political and civic dispositions. And I'm really curious to hear what insights you might be able to share on youth consumption and production of media as it relates to political engagement and participation.
Yeah, so in a way similar to what I was saying about young people having political voice early on, And as older people complain, they don't read newspaper anymore. A lot of times young people tell us that the so-called legacy or old media is irrelevant. It's not inclusive of their diverse generation and the voices they have, which is not a monolith. So they go to new media. So social media and kind of the youth-generated media is really where they're going to get information about election and other social issues, but also increasingly they're making media. And that's what they trust a lot. We find many things about this. So first, that when we survey teenagers who are not yet 18, already 40% of these teenagers were making media about social and political matter. That kind of number has really rose significantly over the last 3 or 4 years. It used to be maybe 1 in 5 young people would do that. Now it's really half are doing that. And not only that, teenagers are talking about politics using media. The youngest of our young people, so the teenagers, tend to use more visual media like TikTok and Instagram and especially Snapchat as opposed to older people. What we find though when we do see young people making media is that perhaps because they have to actually look up things and inform themselves, they feel more empowered and informed about participating in political matters. So that's really important, that making media actually enables them to feel like they qualify, they know what they're talking about, and therefore they want to participate. They become more attached to and committed to the issues they're communicating about. So it's really important to know that. I think that one of the things that we find in the media literature research is that they really are powerful in empowering young people and amplifying their voices, but the opportunities to know how to do that, and especially through school, is unequally distributed. So that, as Sean was talking about policies in civic education earlier, there's some media literacy policies that are passing, including in my own home state of Massachusetts. And that can be a really strong lever to make sure that how to teach media literacy and how to make media that's really socially good are being communicated in school, and students are getting equal access to that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's interesting as I reflect on both what you and David said, I think there's a common thread that we're going to continue to see about how we are actually framing youth engagement and the things that we're actually lifting up and saying this is a relevant and legitimate form of engagement. So when we look at the ways that young people are responding to surveys about the extent to which they are patriotic or the feelings that they have about their country. And I'm coming to you in a moment, Jane, because I know I actually read an article of yours that was on this very topic. It just seems like part of the work is reframing perhaps a quite static understanding of what it means to truly be politically engaged or politically engaged. So thank you so much, Kay. And shifting gears to you now, Jane, your work provides some valuable insights into strategies that educators and others working on the ground in civic education can put into practice to make it more effective. And you've done some significant research on specific methods to help students, and especially students of color, become engaged with civic and political issues. What practical advice can you give to educators based on your research?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Rashid, and for the opportunity to be in conversation here with my peers and all of these wonderful participants here. I think sometimes when we think about specific methods, especially in the classroom, there are sort of underlying assumptions about what works or should work in a classroom. And so some of my work really pushes us to think a little bit more about what works for whom, right? So with that in mind, I think it's really important for teachers and administrators to know that meaningful experiences is the key here, right? To Kay's earlier point, and David's as well, young people will be engaged in issues that they care about, as long as they can see that that engagement is worthwhile, right? That engaging actually matters. So whether that is a simulation that they do in the classroom or projects that pique their interest in current issues, or even service learning opportunities or experiential learning projects that get students involved in the community somehow. Really, no matter the actual method, right, of which, quality discussions, project-based learning, all of these things, and I think Sean even alluded to some of them, are just examples, right? And no matter what the actual methods, young people really just want to know that they can actually make a difference, right, or do something to make things better. And by and large, studies in the literature show that when young people can see themselves as part of something, they will engage with it in meaningful ways. So I think the trick here is to help young people see that they can play an important role in our system or our version of a democracy. And of course, the challenge here is that traditional civic education, as some of my panelists have mentioned, has not really done a great job of engaging specifically students of color and seeing themselves as part of our democracy in meaningful ways. And luckily, more folks are working on this issue, and some examples have already been given earlier, but I think classroom experiences continue to sort of lag behind in these areas rather than sort of out of school experiences and, broad school like democracy prep and things like that. And so Meira and I have both written about this issue sort of in different ways, and feel free to read more about it in my article on civic debt or Meira's work on the civic empowerment gap. And I think someone's actually putting those links into the chat right now. But essentially the problem is this, if I had to summarize it, right, for many reasons that we don't really have time to get into right now, formal civic education, to think about, government as civic classes, has not really done enough to help young people, especially young people of color, see themselves as actors in our system or as people who can enact change. And Meira talks about this as the civic empowerment gap in her work, where young people of color or those from lower income families, for one reason or another, aren't as civically or politically empowered to engage. And I tackle these issues by looking at a civic debt that we owe specifically to young people of color when we neglect their experiences in a system when we teach. And what I mean by this is when we teach about our system of government, so often the idealism that we teach, so think about rule of law or due process, don't actually ring true for young people of color, which in the end can really marginalize them, because they have a sense that the system was not created for them or that their experiences don't matter, or worse, that the system is actually created to repress and oppress them, right? In other words, they end up sensing that our democracy or the rights and liberties we teach about in the class are really meant for someone else. And to mitigate these issues, it's so important for students to have formal civic educational experiences or general schooling experiences that can show them that not only do they belong and that those rights and liberties are theirs, but that the system ultimately belongs to them, right? The future kind of rests in their hands. So all that to say, for teacher administrators, make sure you work with young people to leverage their voices in the classroom, right? Choose or support curricula, lessons, activities, or programs that really allow them to have agency in practicing and doing democracy, all the while trying to make sense of how their own experiences map onto, or maybe not, the ideals outlined by the Constitution, so that they have reasons to actually learn and remember the knowledge that, Sean and David both talked about, that's lacking in our polity. And so many young people just don't see themselves in kind of the rote memorization of facts and things, right? So it's so imperative for them to see how they can be a part of our constitutional democracy by practicing it.
Thank you so much for that. And you've also written about the importance of teaching students how to accept and deal with conflict. So I would love to hear why you think that's so important. And again, any practical advice that you can share with our audience to ensure that they can really approach this aspect of the work properly and effectively.
Yeah, so I think it's really difficult these days to sort of turn on the news or look at social media without having your blood boil or see conflict sort of at every turn with various things going on. And I think we're in a political moment where almost everything feels super contentious. And to Kay's point earlier, social media has definitely played a role in this, but I've heard from more and more classroom teachers, especially ones that teach civics or social studies, who want more guidance on how to navigate these challenges, right? And without sounding sort of too prosaic, I really think back to Hannah Arendt's writings on forgiveness. And there's an article that I've written about conflict and conciliation. But Arendt says essentially that forgiveness is the only way we can move forward as a people, right? Or move past the fear of messing up, which can often immobilize us. So think about a time when you felt like you had to walk on eggshells around someone because you did something wrong or they felt like you had wronged them. And what I mean is, in this moment, it's really important for teachers, so practically, to model and teach students how to forgive one another, to have grace for one another and for oneself, and to forgive themselves so that we can fully realize the humanity in other people. And this doesn't mean that they have to compromise their notions of right or wrong, right? But it does mean that they have to recognize that their own notions aren't the only right ways to live in the world. So only when we recognize the humanity of others in this way can we get past the kind of scorekeeping that we seem to be doing and witnessing in society a lot today. And of course, to do any of this really requires setting up the right kind of classroom environment for your students, right? If they're teachers who are wanting to try out or learn more practical ways to do that, I actually have an edited book that's coming out next week on, how to make these kinds of discussions work in the classroom. And I think someone is putting that in the link as well. In any case, I think conflict is here to stay on the short term, right? At least for now in this political moment. So it's so important for teachers to learn and help their students learn how to actually deal with that conflict instead of just working around it or avoiding it.
Thank you. In these polarized times, many educators' instinctual response is probably to seek consensus or avoid conflict completely. And it sounds like, and I agree with you, that we should be reframing our thinking to understand that conflict is an inevitable part of being a member of a political or social body, number one, and that exploring controversial issues can build pro-democratic values. A quick point I'd love to highlight quickly from your research is that this kind of agonistic deliberation can actually help empower students who feel marginalized by the status quo. So bringing up all these controversial topics actually creates a space for folks to have both a logical and emotional response that changes the way they engage with folks. And that's also in your conflict and conciliation article, and I highly recommend that folks read that. I would love to turn to you now, Meira, and thank you, Jane. Jane has introduced some important issues around both civic equity and civic polarization. How are these linked? Are there shared causes of or mitigations of the civic empowerment gap on the one hand and political polarization on the other?
Thanks, Rashid, for that question. And thank you to the organizers for setting this up and to my colleagues for giving us so much already to think about. Yeah, I think it is important. So the short answer is yes. I think that there are real links between the civic empowerment gap and the kind of polarization that we've been discussing, both as an impediment and also potentially as an opportunity, maybe a bit as a sidestep and then as a solution. So what we are, so the predictors of the civic empowerment gap, and this is the reason it's so connected, I think, to what Jane was talking about with the civic debt, are really consistent. And I've been seeing many of these come up in the chat too. There have been questions about families, questions about culturally coherent and congruent curricula, questions about communities and sort of government. So when kids and young adults are growing up and being educated in spaces that feel marginalized, that are economically marginalized, that are often geographically marginalized, either being rural or being in an urban core that also feels sort of neglected by others, when they are in families that have low levels of formal education themselves, and especially for young people also leave with low levels of formal education, they feel forced out of school. We've seen with COVID, obviously, a huge increase in the number of kids who have felt the need to leave school, whether to work or just because they feel so alienated, et cetera. These are very strong predictors of lack of political power, right? Lack of certain forms of formal political engagement, and of some predictors of political polarization, feeling marginalized, unheard, looking for who it is who can be, supportive, right? And feels as if they're actually being listened to. And I think that the ways that we can respond to these reactions to feeling undervalued, disrespected, as if formal political and civic engagement fails to offer real opportunities to improve one's own life, the lives of people one cares about, your family, your friends, your communities. The ways that we can address that can actually, I think, strengthen our democracy, and by expanding political engagement, civic engagement, and actually democratizing political and civic power. And over time, I hope, although I don't know that there's research that supports this, also reduce political polarization somewhat. And I think that there are a couple of things that we can do. One is the polarization that is strongest is at the national level, right? Now, national political polarization is increasingly starting to impact state and even local community engagement. We're seeing it show up in school boards, we're seeing it show up in city councils in ways that it didn't used to. But it is still the case that local civic and political engagement, local civic and political issues are far less polarizing and divisive than national ones are. And so to the extent that we can help young people engage in and focus on those issues, they also have a much greater chance of making a difference, right? It's very, 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 very hard to change the, the minimum wage at a national level or to address voting access and voting rights at a national level. It's much, much easier, say, to expand precinct hours or to deal with road safety or to expand a composting program or whatever at the local level, right? And so you can get a much greater experience of success if you're working at the local level. You can also avoid a number of these really politically divisive issues that educators and if agency develops, then sense that we've heard, say, Jane and others talking about collective efficacy and collective relationships. You can start to build relationships with others who may not be those may not be those who look like you, but who actually then can build a sense of community. Oh, we're in this together.
Thank you so much for that. I would love to shift just slightly to ask somewhat broadly how you would define a good civic education.
Thanks. So a good civic education is one whose outcomes expand individual democratic capacity and strengthen our democracy as a whole. So what that means is that we need to expand the number of people who engage in formal and informal, insider and outsider, right, civic action and democratic engagement. And then so that's about quantity. We also have to improve the quality of that engagement, right? So make it more inclusive, more attentive to our shared civic values, and actually lifting up our civic values again, right? And I think actually helping our democracy strengthen as a democracy, right? So there's both the quantity and quality of individual action, and then there's also recovering, right? So Sean talked at the very beginning about the total cratering of trust, which arguably is in part because of a cratering of responsiveness, right? And actual democratic efficacy. And so we want to strengthen a democracy. I talked in my book, No Citizen Left Behind, that came out now a decade ago. I said even, then that it's not clear that we were a democracy then, right? Because if you can predict based on on people's level of education, on their income, on their racial or ethnic identification, based on where they live, how much power they have, then that is not a democracy, right? And so we need to make ourselves a better democracy, and that's what a good civic education will do. And what we've heard from our other speakers is that a good civic education that does that is one that actually has young people participate in democracy and actually practice citizenship. This is the one thing that I find utterly baffling, is that in every other dimension of education and learning and schools, we know, we see, okay, kids need to learn knowledge, they have to practice skills, they have to do the thing we want them to learn, right? So we don't just tell them about reading, we have them read. We don't just have them read writing by others and take apart what makes it good writing, although we do that, we have them write. We have them do mathematics, and they do mathematics badly, and then because they do that, they then learn to do mathematics well, right? They play baseball and they go off and they pick dandelions rather than attending to the ball, but we know that they have to do that to then become good baseball players. That's what we have to do in civic education. There is no reason to think that because of like a few weeks here in middle school and a semester there in high school that they're going to come out and be good citizens. We don't think that that's the case for reading, for math, for science, for basketball, for art, for any other field, right? We have them do this for years on end. And that's what we should be doing in civic education, is having them do citizenship, because that's how they will learn to be good citizens.
Thank you so much for that. I completely agree. There's a desperate need for a greater level of true experiential learning, coupled with opportunities to build a sense of efficacy in our young folks. And I'm hoping that later in our conversation, we can return to these concepts. But for this point, I would like to shift our focus a little bit and dive a little deeper in this next part of our session with a discussion among all of you. I'll direct each question initially to one member of our panel, and then I'm going to leave space for the rest of you to share additional thoughts. I'd like to remind the audience that if you have questions you'd like to hear our panelists discuss, you should be sure to enter them into the chat box, as you have been doing throughout this session. Our first question is, taking into account the numerous challenges our nation is grappling with, including the recent failure to pass voting rights legislation in the Senate, to what extent is better and more widespread civic education really essential for sustaining American democracy? We'll start with you, David.
I would say that civic education is absolutely critical for the democratic crisis that we are in right now. I don't say that naively. It's not as though these are easy things to implement at the local level, as we've seen over the national debate that's going on right now about what's taught in schools. But at the very least, I would hope that people would recognize that civics is essential. And one important place where it's taught is schools. It's not the only place, and so we should not forget that civic education actually expands beyond what happens in the schools, but schools are absolutely critical. And I've been studying civic education for a long time, and in the past, when we would talk about what was critical about civic education, it was really more a matter of encouraging greater participation in the system, and we didn't really have to talk much about the very idea of democracy itself, or the democratic norms on which the entire thing is built. Well, that's where we're at now. And I would say that itself is a product of poor education, civic education in the past, that we have to be in the business of trying to convince people that democracy is worth it. So it's not an easy fight, and it will be a fight in many places, but it's worth doing, because without it, I just fear that a democracy that is built on norms will crumble.
Thank you. I'd love to invite our other panelists to jump in with additional thoughts here in response to what David said, or taking it in another direction as well.
Can I chime in on this? Because I think David's exactly right. And I think this is one of the things that is so challenging right now about teaching at this time, is that a few years ago, I think it was clearer what kinds of norms one could assert as a civics teacher or a social studies teacher, or even as an English teacher, a science teacher, right? And say, okay, these are shared norms, right? But I think that's harder now. There are fewer of those norms. So something like, when I was a middle school teacher, I could say, I didn't use the language of anti-racism, but at the time I would say, you know, we are not a racist classroom, right? There's certain things, and like that was just a given. But now, say the language of anti-racism has been so attached to the left that it is seen as a partisan move by a teacher, right? To say that I have an anti-racist classroom. And so then suddenly that's very unsettling as a teacher. What does that mean? What kind, you know, also particularly, I mean, this has been true somewhat for the Democratic Party, but particularly for the Republican Party, as its norms shifted under Trump, like it was much, much easier in 2012, say, to say, all right, we're going to talk about macroeconomic policy and we'll compare certain kinds of regulations and protectionism and so forth. And you would sort of think that that might be on the left, and then we'll talk about the free market and so forth on the right. But then you have these policy switches, right? And then you have these norm switches. So it's not clear anymore, I think, for teachers, what it means to present a bipartisan perspective, what it means to present sort of, you know, multiple sides. And so that leaves teachers much really unsettled too. I will put in the chat in just a second. We've developed a set of resources through my educational ethics initiative and Justice in Schools for educators to have conversations with one another, with school administrators, school board leaders, principals, and actually parents through PTA meetings to actually talk about these hard choices that they have to make, because education is always political. And one of the problems that educators run into is that it's seen as political only when they take a step that is disliked by others. And to the extent that they can actually start the conversation about education being a series of political choices, no matter what, before something comes up, then it means that when there is a conflict at a school or in a district or in a state, they're often in a better place to have the conversations, because people see each other as being well-intentioned and thoughtful, even if they disagree about the specific thing. Sorry, I went on too long, I'll stop.
I think you actually set us up really beautifully for our next question, which is going to focus on the challenges that schools face in this politicized climate. So Jane, I would love to hear any additional recommendations, because I do think that you've touched on some when you were speaking earlier. What is it that schools can be doing in order to strengthen civic education at this time, given all of the hurdles that they face because of this level of polarization and the fear of saying the wrong thing or new legislation that's kind of putting a muzzle on certain forms of civic education at this time?
Yeah, thanks for that, Rashid. Actually, I'm working with a colleague at MSU right now, Rebecca Jacobson, on a different study that's looking at sort of like the chilling effect of all these CRT bans. So I don't know if you follow, but like lots of school districts and school board meetings have been in the news as of late for all sorts of things that come up related to mask mandates, legislation banning CRT in the classroom, things of that nature. And so we actually did some surveying of school districts and parents and teachers in the state of Michigan. Sorry, looking at, because there have been a few Michigan school boards who've been in the news, and trying to figure out what is the impact of these things that Meira talked about earlier, of the national rhetoric really influencing local politics. And we're seeing a lot more of that, right? So 10 years ago, you talk about local school boards, and that's sort of like you had very specific things that local school boards care about and things like that. But nowadays, there's this infiltration of national rhetoric and national polarization that is happening and having a lot of impact on actual schools and parents and principals and teachers all trying to figure out what to do. And one of the things that we're seeing, and I should say that the work is preliminary, so we're still collecting data at the moment. But one of the things is thinking about strengthening that local voice again, right? Just it's not to say divorce it from the national rhetoric, but there are things that local communities do care about because this is the place that they live. Now, that doesn't mean that all local communities all agree on things, but there are things that they can agree about because they do share commonalities, right? And so trying to figure out, and as much as we talk about helping young people see themselves in the community, it's almost like building and healing those communities, right? Helping people see the things that they have in common in the places that they live, and rather than being pulled apart by sort of the machinations that are happening with national politics, excuse me, and sort of the political parties pulling things apart. And so I think I would encourage, local school districts and schools to really think about that, right? And I again, it sounds like a trope to go back to this like conflict conciliation thing, but think about it. All things are relationships, and think about the relationships you had. And I think COVID has really even made it harder to connect with people in those ways, right? You no longer see your neighbors at the grocery store. You don't walk down the street and see them and say hello and those kinds of things. And so there's a lot of community building, I think, that has to happen, because to David's point, like schools are this heart of the community, and we want to be able to reclaim that and make sure that they are these ecosystem that allows people to feel safe, that there's commonality and there are things to fight for.
I'd love to invite additional thoughts here.
I want to maybe chime in really quickly, because Jane just mentioned school as a community and center of the community. And I think we really have to, in a way, start to bring in back the community into school too. I know it is a really difficult time to be doing that, because there are lots of contentious debates that are happening, particularly at the school board level. But things like community schools really thriving in some ways. And I'm sure Rashid, your school collaborates with a lot of community organizations, and so does my local school, which is in a really working class community. And I think when we think about how the community mentors, community organization and governmental agencies can come in, for example, by co-running a teen polling program, right? So there's a lot of programs in states that can have 16 and 17-year-olds to work as a poll workers in election. That's one way for the community to come in and for teenagers to learn about how the election runs, but also for the nonprofits to really come in as community partners and not just sort of somebody that just coexists in the community. I think can be another really way to enrich the teaching and learning, but also to start to build that community fabric where school is really the center of civic education and civic engagement and empowerment for the community, rather than just they stay during the day and get educated and the content is given to them. I think there's more to the community. So I would like to see that more.
Thank you so much. Just going to leave a couple of seconds in case anyone wanted to add any final thoughts here. Okay. Just muted myself. I am still curious if we can just return to the idea of practitioners specifically dealing with the civic empowerment gap under these challenging conditions. I'm really curious in hearing some thoughts, ground level versus field level, to try and kind of encapsulate some of this for our participants.
Yeah, I guess I'll start by just making a comment. I don't know that this answers your question, Rashid, but I think part of, the things that we're looking at now, to David's earlier point, is I personally kind of read it as the failure of our society of, investing in civic education for so long, right? Like we're seeing that failure point. So I think for a long time we were sort of naively going like, it's fine. Like the norms are there, like, right, things are going okay. And it's not, so even though I talked about my work dealing with specifically looking at, youth of color, right, and how there's disenfranchisement there. But I think in the long term, if you look back, I think civic education in the land has really failed everyone, right? Like the fact that we're seeing these fissures, it's the fact we are no longer able to build these fabric because we have had so much disinvestment in civic education for so long that it's not just, we're depending on parents or family members to be able to translate some of the civic knowledge or norms. We're allowing other groups and communities to try and do that work as patchwork, where I think, official schooling, I should say, should have really reinforced some of this, and not as reinforcing as in like, forcing everybody to believe in one thing. That's not what I mean. What I mean is to showcase for students in school settings when they're there, like the importance, right, of coming together, thinking through our differences, having these discussions, thinking about civility, thinking about civic friendships, thinking about all of these things that really matter to allow that fabric to continue to be woven. And so even though I think, thinking about what can schools do and from a field level or a ground level, I think there's a lot of mending work that has to be done, right? So it's hard for me to pinpoint sort of like one thing to do, because it's kind of like, the ship is sinking and it's like, get a bucket. I don't know, is the bucket the right thing, right? Like there's so many things. We need people to be bailing out. We need people to be patching holes. We need people to be doing all of these things. And so teachers specifically have a role to play, right? I think that starts with not shying away from doing this work. That goes with, taking on that responsibility and saying, no, we really have to do this, and not just in civic classrooms, not just in government classrooms, that, in whatever subject area you teach, in K through 12, right? And even with little kids, being able to do that work a little bit at a time, I think is really important.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Kay.
That's okay.
To build on what Jane is saying, because the needs are so great, I think there's a risk, and this is sort of related to actually what Kay was saying early on, there's a risk that you feel overwhelmed and as if, like, what can we do because the whole thing is sinking and I'm going to freeze up. Or alternatively, and more positively, we can think there's so many ways to get involved, so many ways to support high quality civic learning and to support our democracy, that it's not an either or kind of thing, right? So like I've been seeing in the chat questions about volunteerism versus say, culturally congruent civic education versus say work with families versus say thinking about formal democratic, learning of processes or educating for American democracy. This is not a versus, it's an all in, right? So I think that we should all see ourselves as having a really powerful role to play, regardless of what we do, who we are, where we're positioned, because we all need to be contributing to this. And Dave said this when he started us out, saying that so much of civic education happens in school culture, right? So this is not only about what can happen in a formal civics class for the few minutes that we get them. It's about what is happening in extracurriculars, what's happening in the cafeteria, what's happening in the science classroom when, say, a kid brings up a question about climate change, what is happening in the relationship between among the principal and the teachers and the students, and who has voice and so forth. All of these things matter. What's happening in social media, are kids allowed to produce things and share what they're producing? We all have a role to play, and it's only together that we can support democratic education.
I wanted to make a really brief comment about sort of the field-wide response to the current state of democracy. And I think as a community of history education and civic education, I think there's been sort of unusual coming together of those two fields that used to be very separate. The courses are separate, the fields were very separate. I actually had very few colleagues that I knew in the history education community. The Educating for American Democracy initiative is one recent effort that has scaled quite well so far in an effort to do a few things with really full embrace of the fact that we disagree on many fronts. As a nation, we always have. And we actually need to rebuild that muscle together. Part of that is really exposing students for multiple perspectives and full accounting of American narratives, both the commonality and diverse narratives different Americans tell about our origin and about our history. And the way we act and interact with our civic institutions are deeply tied to our culture, our regionalism and local voice, as well as the national identity, right? So that has really helped us sort of try to think as a field about where do we disagree, how do we leverage the tension that we've always had, different fields and different kind of segments within the field to come together on this one priority, which is to really help every student succeed in constitutional democracy as a civic actor. With that, there has been lots of resources developed. And that's part of the response to the kind of noises in the society about sort of what should we teach? What can we talk about? What can we not talk about? The attitude that EAD has taken in particular is that multiple perspectives exist and students deserve to know about them and then have a full understanding of that so they can develop their own voice and make choices as citizens. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much for those thoughts, and to everyone for that really thoughtful conversation. I'd like to open our session up now to questions submitted by audience members. While we know we won't be able to get to every question, thank you all for all of your submissions. They're going to help inform our ongoing conversations, events, and work around these issues. The first question comes from an audience member with a concern about ensuring that students with disabilities have equal access to civic learning opportunities. Does research shed any light on to what extent civic preparation is inclusive and how to ensure it's available to all students?
I'm happy to start. So I think that there's, so I have a couple thoughts about this. The questions, I think the work that many disabled youth and adults and disability advocates have done around challenging sort of neurotypical assumptions and redefining sort of neurotypicality and neuroatypicality on a much broader scale. And then also challenging, and I think actually under COVID, also saying, you know, we've been asking for certain kinds of adjustments and accommodations for years that you were suddenly magically willing and able to provide, right, when it was needed by students who aren't classified as disabled. That there's been a huge, I think, upsurge in work by disabled people and advocates for them that has, I think, had real civic and political impact and been inspiring, and links with a lot of the forms of civic engagement by other groups who have felt oppressed, marginalized, disempowered, et cetera, which is finding routes to redefine what people assume is normal, or right, and to expand the range of voices and to expand the number of forms in which civic responsiveness and civic engagement happens, right? So this gets us back to the media production. This gets us back to certain forms of outsider politics, to protests, also to actually engaging in legal change, to, you know, filing lawsuits, et cetera. And I think that I think of particularly as you had the confluence of the Black Lives Matter movement, environmental justice movements, COVID justice, health justice movements, educational justice movements, and we start to see, particularly on the left, a much greater interest in really looking intersectionally. I think that we see a lot of exciting examples of civic education and civic engagement that are cutting across groups that formerly were more divided, that they may have been solidaristic but separate. I'm not sure if we're going to see that on the right in the same way. I'll be curious to see. But I do think also that educators have a real opportunity there to help young people see how the things that they care about actually may be experienced and cared about by other members who identify strongly as members of different groups, to try to expand voices and conceptions of what is appropriate for who should have power and voice and presence in our collective life together.
Can I just add quickly, endorsing everything that Meira said, and also thanking the questioner for raising the issue of disabilities, because I would say from my discipline of political science, where there's just not been as much attention to civic education in the past as maybe there should have been. It was once a hot topic in the 1960s, and then it sort of faded away, and now people still study it, but it has never really been at the forefront of the discipline. And the very fact that I, as a political scientist, would have a difficult time answering your question reflects the fact that we are still in the infancy of understanding what really works in civic education. And earlier I used the analogy of the drug cocktail, and I was just talking in general about, you know, one type of school that has a positive effect on one outcome, voter turnout. Well, that's just the tip of a very large iceberg, because you could imagine all sorts of questions we'd want to ask, including how to ensure that students who learn in different ways are being, properly educated in civics, and what outcomes do we observe there. There's just a lot more for us to learn, and we aren't there yet. And that's, I would say, on the one hand, a tragedy, but it's also an opportunity, because at this moment, as I think more and more people are paying attention to civic education, it's an opportunity to really figure out what does work for all types of students.
I just want to say again, sorry, go ahead. Really quickly, I think kind of this reviewing of civic pedagogy, again, with the Educated for American Democracy, we did consult quite a bit with things like Universal Learning Framework to really think about what is a good learning environment that's truly inclusive look like, because we had this goal of excellence for all. And that framework of really committing to actually making sure everybody can succeed in civic life really helped us as a field to think through all sorts of diversity, not just racial, of course it's very important, but also these other neurodiversity, mental health factors, and different cultures and different voices and circumstances all came into thinking through that framework. So it's an opportunity to now change the practice and hopefully study it.
Yeah, and all I was going to say is sort of reiterating Meira's earlier point, right? There's a lot of work to be done, and I personally see it as an opportunity, right? A lot of opportunities for different groups to collaborate. Those of us who work in the field know that there are tons of moving parts because everybody is getting involved. So everything from, supporting lowering the voting age, supporting better voting legislation, like all of those kind of legislative things, all the way to working to develop curriculum, right? Working on instruction that supports different levels of learning. And so I think this is where some of these things could be woven into all of the different efforts. So I encourage anybody who's interested in doing that work to, figure out ways to collaborate, because there's a lot going on in the field right now.
Thank you all. Our next question from an audience member who's asking, what does research tell us about civic education, teaching, and learning in early childhood and elementary school years?
I am looking at Jane.
And I'm looking at Kay.
I can start. Just to admit, as a field, we really have serious deficits in the amount of resources that we are offering to elementary educators in particular, and even parents. We just posted some in the chat that are available to public, but there's been some challenges in really thinking about social studies in a much broader way, right? So we are used to teaching it as a middle school, high school course. So when there's so much emphasis on literacy and numeracy, which of course is important, I think the field has a hard time figuring out how do we integrate what's really strong civic learning pedagogy and content into what's already in the school day's curriculum. And there's some innovations happening, and I'm sure Jane has some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so Kay and I were kind of looking at each other because we're actually working on that exact problem right now. We're sort of putting together different ways to think about how we can bolster K-5 social studies in a way that can help support kids to be civic ready, right? And so, for example, I currently work to train pre-service teachers that want to be K-5 teachers. And so, for them as 20-year-olds, right, they have sort of like a fear of social studies. One, either they didn't like it when they were in school, or they don't know what to say about it. And given the current political climate, it seems like a bad time to bring it up at all, especially when you're teaching kindergartens. Like, who wants to bring that up with, cute 5- and 6-year-olds? But the reality is, like, what we try to do, at least on a pre-service level, is to help them see that social studies beyond just, the contentious issues and the histories, right? To my earlier point, it's about social fabric as well. So a lot of the things that little kids learn about their families, their communities, why they matter to whom, and the adults in their life, all of those things are part of helping to lay the foundation for really good, robust civic learning later on, right? So as they expand their scope as first graders, second graders, they can start to think broadly about their community, right? Their city, like, what does that look like? How do I connect? How do I belong? And then all the way to kind of state level, and then, national level, so that by the time we get to middle and high school, they have places places in their brains. Like we know this from learning sciences. If you already have anchors in your brain, you tend to learn things better. And so that by the time they get to these middle and high school classes, that they actually have something to map onto that. They have something to transfer that knowledge, that experience from early grades into. So it is something that we're actively working on. But to Kay's point, it's sort of been woefully under-resourced and utilized.
I forgot to mention one study that does exist, but go ahead, Dave.
Oh, I was just going to tell a quick story to make a point, but why don't you make the more serious point, Kay, and then I'll tell a story.
There's a great things about chat and how the infusion of ELA and social studies is great. And I just forgot to mention that there has been a great study that's longitudinal over 6 years, just looking at how the kindergarten classrooms that integrated civics content, social studies content, had students performing better on the 5th grade reading test. So the researchers at the Fordham Institute argue that it's actually not a replacement, it's a complementary addition to the ELA curriculum that's happening at the very early grade. I'll try to find a link for you and post it in.
The story that I wanted to tell that I hope is germane is something that will not come as a surprise to anyone who actually teaches elementary age kids, but for those of us who maybe are not on a regular basis in a classroom with that age. A few years ago, as an occupational hazard of being a political science professor, I was asked by my own daughter's 5th grade teacher to come in and talk about the presidential election. So I thought, well, I'll do a thing on the Electoral College, which is, kind of hard to explain. And I had this whole exercise that I created, but I didn't want to talk about the actual candidates. So I brought 2 plush toys, Arthur and Francine from Arthur the everybody knows Arthur, right? And it was hilarious when I came into the classroom and I started to talk about Arthur and Francine and how they were running for office. These kids they did not want to talk about Arthur and Francine. They wanted to talk about, this was some years ago, Obama and McCain. And what it taught me, this is my point, is even at that age, kids can be way more sophisticated in their understanding of the political process than I think we give them credit for. And that's what I learned from that, even though my own daughter was in the class. I should have known that, but it was really eye-opening for me. And it's something that I hope at least the research community realizes, because that is an age group. Again, we used to pay more attention to elementary age kids, at least in my own discipline, and more recently we have not, and we should. And I myself have learned that, and I'm grateful that I have.
Our final question is theoretical in nature. Really interesting question here. Would asking US students to take a test similar to the naturalization exam be useful to ensure students are prepared to vote?
I'm happy to talk about that. I don't know if others do. So as I think was mentioned, a number of states have actually implemented this, and it sounds, when you're in a state legislature, like a magic bullet. Well, this is the test you have to take to become a US citizen, so obviously we should have high school students take this test. My own view on this is it probably doesn't hurt, but nobody should think that this is solving anything. For one thing, it's not much of a test. And actually, if you want to get really technical about it, what you take to become a US citizen is actually just 10 questions selected from a much larger set. So it's not like what the students are doing actually replicates what happens in the citizenship exam. But that aside, that test was not developed by, as near as I can tell, anybody with any experience what a good test entails. And so, if at the school level, it triggers discussions of what it means to be informed about the political process, probably doesn't hurt, but nobody should think that that is in and of itself enough or even close to enough. And people who know far more about education may want to say more, but I'll leave my own.
No, go ahead, Meira.
All right. Yeah, I was going to be much more blunt and say no. Asking US students to take a test like the one that immigrants take for citizenship would not be useful to ensure that students are prepared to vote. I think there actually is a risk that there will be a shift toward preparing students to be able to, to know the answer to 100 plus multiple choice questions and then be able to answer 10 of them at will. And that actually would be the wrong direction to go for civic education. Again, to get on my hobby horse, what we want to do, and I think what you've heard from all of us, is that to have students be prepared, active, engaged, empowered, and democratically oriented citizens, they have to do the things that constitute that, right? They have to practice that. They have to do that through classroom discussions, through simulations, through through engaging with one another, through fighting against injustice, through finding allies in the community, through trying to solve problems together, through exercising their voice and having that go badly and figuring out how they recover, through working on a project and having it fail and realizing actually that happens a lot in our shared civic and political life, and developing the resilience and the attention and the perseverance to be able to go back after it again, rather than saying, forget it, I'm out of here, right? Like that is what will help us have a good civic education, and nothing on there was about answering multiple choice questions. I think it's a much more complex question about are there certain kinds of, say, state level required civic education assessments that would help to improve civic education? My guess is that on this panel, we disagree with one another about that. And I think that that could be a truly interesting conversation, but I do not think that the citizenship exam would actually help support things. Sorry, over to you, Jane.
And all I was going to say, those of you who are still here with us, if you remember making, like 100 on an algebra test, when was the last time you used algebra? And if I put it in front of you, would you be able to do it now, right? And I think there's something to that. This is a different question to David's point. It's an assessment question, right? Like if the quality of the assessment, so as a curriculum and instruction person who look at civic assessments and assessments in general, I think that the quality of those things become the question and the key here. But that particular test is not what we would consider a quality assessment. And so even though it serves its purposes for different things, and to David's point, does it hurt for people to know the stuff? No, absolutely not. But would it help kind of steer the ship and write the thing? I just don't think that's where we should put our eggs.
Thank you. And thank you again to our panelists and to our audience members for all of your insightful questions and comments, and for your deep commitment to this important work. I'm going to now turn it over to Michael Rebell, the Executive Director of the Center for Educational Equity, to close this event.
Thank you very much, Rashid. Thank you to all the panelists in this really stimulating conversation. Our Center for Educational Equity at Teachers College is dedicated to a mission of promoting equity for all students for a quality education. And in recent years, like so many of the people who have tuned in today and our panelists, we've realized that the core of a quality education has to include meaningful opportunities for civic preparation. And I'd rather use the word civic preparation than civic education, because as the panelists really emphasized time and again in this discussion, good civics teaching in the 21st century means knowledge. Yes, it means knowledge, but it means skills, it means experiences, it means understanding democratic values. And at our center, we take what we call a rights-based approach. We think that we have to emphasize that every child in America has a right to a good quality civic preparation, and our society as a whole has a right to have its youth educated in the tenets of a good civic education if our democracy is going to survive. So I just want to very briefly summarize the main points that really have come across to me in this discussion as takeaways, and then talk very briefly about some things that all of us can do to pick up the message, the strong message that all our panelists made, that we've all got to get involved in this crusade, I would almost say, given the times we're in, to really promote good civic education. So to begin, we know there are substantial problems, substantial shortcomings, as Sean Healy laid them out, in the way schools are dealing with civic education today. When you think back, when our education system was founded, the Common School movement and all, the basic purpose of education was civic education. That's what schools were established for, to make sure that this fledgling experiment in mass democracy that our founders had put forward could really work. And they understood, and we've understood ever since then, that you can't have a meaningful, sustainable democracy if all the citizens are not well educated. In those days, all the citizens may have been a small number of white male property owners, but today it's virtually everyone in our society, and we all have to really make much greater efforts, especially given the current situation, to make that meaningful. We've heard that the research shows that good civic preparation makes a difference in voting, it makes a difference in civic engagement later in life. And we've also been instructed in some of the specific ways, the specific policies that states can adopt, the specific instructional methods that teachers can use, the specific ways we can create an ethos to promote democracy, and the specific ways that we can get youth much more involved in understanding the importance of democracy, and to some extent in understanding that by having experiences in doing it. We've also talked about the polarization in our society. And in the chat and the discussions, everybody is clear that we have many challenges to our democracy today. And the polarization, those challenges to democracy, have created an atmosphere that makes it more difficult for practitioners, for teachers, for school boards, for others concerned about these matters, to do what's necessary. But ironically, at the same time that it's more difficult, as our panelists have repeatedly emphasized, it's also much more important. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the future of our democratic system really does depend on whether we can carry out this mission of providing good civic education to everybody. So all of us, those on board today, those who may be listening to this recording on tape in the future, we've got to make civic education a priority, and we've got to do what we can do to make school boards, parents, students, legislatures, the Congress, and the public at large understand the need to prioritize good civic preparation. So we need a national cry that civic education is really important. But as has been pointed out repeatedly in our discussion, civic education has to take different paths. It has to emphasize different norms, different language in different parts of the country. So we're very pleased that we've got a national audience today, and we hope that that national audience, those of you who are listening to this important discussion, can carry this message to your local communities in the ways that it has to be heard. In general, our final message is everybody needs to get involved in this work. To help along the way, CivXNow has a number of upcoming events. I think they're being put on the screen right now. People should pay attention to these. There'll be more events coming through. CivXNow is a very active organization, creating a lot of opportunities for people. And you can do things like checking out the Civic Secures Democracy toolkit that CivXNow has, get more information about the federal bill that's now before Congress and what you can do to help support it. That is a really important national effort. As far as our Center for Educational Equity is concerned, one of our big initiatives now that I just want to very briefly mention is we actually have a federal lawsuit pending. We are asking the United States Supreme Court to consider this question of whether civic education is a right for individual students and a right for our country at large. I can't get into the details of the legal theories here, but suffice it to say, I think we have a real shot at getting the Supreme Court to consider this matter, given where our state of democracy is. Those who want more information about it can check our website that's listed on the screen. I also want to mention that, as many of you know, the Supreme Court can choose which cases it wants to take, and it tends to choose very few of them. So we're in a competition to get the attention of the Supreme Court. Things that help is amicus briefs. We've gotten about 15 or 20 groups that have already supported this effort by submitting amicus briefs in the lower courts. And if any of you represent organizations that might be interested in helping this effort to get the Supreme Court to understand the importance of their galvanizing citizen understanding, public understanding, and public commitment to this. We'd appreciate it. Last item I'll mention is that on March 24th, the Center for Educational Equity will be sponsoring a much more extensive webinar where we'll talk about the lawsuit. We'll also talk about much more concrete ways that young people, parents, teachers, others, school board members interested in these issues, concrete steps they can take to help this effort. So finally, I want to thank the panelists again. Thank you to David Campbell, to Kawashima-Ginsberg, to Jane Lowe, and Meira Levinson, to one of the most stimulating discussions of this issue that I've had the privilege to listen to. And I also want to thank the staff people, the many staff people who worked so hard to put this together. That includes from CivXNow, Sean Healy, Abby Kaplan, Ace Parsi, Amber Cruz-Mooring, and Jacob Berkman, and our CEE staff that includes Jessica Wolf, Leila Subani, Amy Francisco, Nick Berkowitz. And thank you to all of you in the audience for your time, attention, and commitment for keeping the important work of making our democracy strong a reality. And I think that is the end of our webinar. So thank you all again.